Well, as many of you are aware, we've had to close the museum to the public because of coronavirus. But now we're in a position where we've actually had to close the site to all our staff. To start with, we're going to do a bit of a sectional tour. We'll break into different pieces of our tank story hall, the hall behind me, where we've laid out some classic tanks, just over 30 of them, armoured vehicles there, to tell the story of the tank and how it fits in with the story of warfare, mainly in the 20th century. So we'll start with that one and we'll see how far and how much we can do, but please carry on watching, carrying on supporting us. This talk, or this part of the tour of the Tank Story Hall at the Tank Museum, is going to have a look at that area of 1940, the Blitzkrieg campaign as we call it, or as many people now call it, and just a little bit of the build-up and why we put those vehicles, those particular vehicles there. Now, I've already talked about that period of experimentation that goes through in the 1920s and 1930s, but one of the areas that so often gets forgotten or overlooked or is hidden by German propaganda that is so effective and is bought into, of course, by the defeated Allied nations in 1940. This idea that the Germans had been supremely confident, had planned all this and knew exactly what they were doing. And this stamp, this word Blitzkrieg, explains all that, lightning war. When in actual fact, when you pick apart what was going on in the late 1930s, how this all occurred, that campaign of 1940, it is a very different story. And that different story, a bit like talking about First World War, how myth is very hard to break down once it's established compared to actually there's plenty of evidence, it's been written about a long time, what's behind that myth, why did that myth build up, and the idea that perhaps that story is a bit different. So looking at this period, that build up to war in the 1930s, Hitler considered himself a great diplomat. He has achieved his aims, or many of his aims he's achieving in Europe, by sheer effrontery and bluff, not by military force. So he comes to power in 1933. As we've mentioned earlier, the German military are doing experimentation with armoured vehicles. They've got ideas. They are given almost the leash is taken off the military. When Hitler comes to power in 1933, they start a program of tank building. Hitler is quite happy to see the Versailles Peace Treaty as he established himself getting ignored or then ripped up. So he reintroduces conscription for the German military. Nothing happens in the West. In other words, Britain and France, we don't do anything about it. When he reoccupies the Rhineland, again, nothing is done about this. The Anschluss in Austria, first of all demanding parts of Czechoslovakia and then getting the whole of Czechoslovakia, including, of course, that large arms industry they've got. All of this happens through, as how Hitler sees it, through his diplomatic powers. And there's a point where he believes this is going to continue. He goes into Poland. I mean, just before he goes into Poland in 1939, one of the most amazing things he's managed to coup is to get a deal with Soviet Russia and Stalin. And that idea that fascist Germany actually does a deal with the Soviets, you know, again, for Hitler and for many in Germany and other parts of the world as well, it just sort of seems to show that this guy seems to know what he's on about. He's very clever at pulling off these diplomatic coups and getting what he wants. So the German military, it is ready to a certain degree, but in 1939, when it goes into Poland, it's okay in the sense of it's much bigger, it defeats the Polish army. The Polish army have to face up to the Soviets coming in the other direction as well. So it's defeated from armies coming on both sides. But actually that force is quite a small force as the German military, and it's still a learning force. It's still struggling with some of its new tanks, etc. A lot of breakdowns, a lot of issues that come out of that. But it wins in that campaign. What is the shock for Hitler is when war is declared against Poland, Hitler thinks that his bluff, as it were, the way he's been able to handle other European nations will continue. His bluff is called in 1939 when Britain and France then declare war, and Hitler is shocked by that. And in turn, so is the German High Command, because they are not expecting this idea of any sort of major European war at this stage. They are simply not ready. The German military has already informed Hitler they think if war is likely, it won't be to something like about 1943, that their forces will have been built up in the manner that they want them to. So this is a real shock for Hitler. He ponders the situation, wonders what he's going to do about it, decides he is going to attack in the west. He is going to the French do a small attack in the Saar area, doesn't come to much, but it's going to be Germany that takes the bull by the horns, is going to do the attack. German High Command are ridiculously worried about this, in fact to the point that one of them starts leaking their plans to the Western Allies, Britain and France. At this particular time, Belgium is neutral, but the Western Allies, just looking at how they think they're going to defend if Germany does attack in the West, they've got the French have built the Maginot Line, this massive long fortification on most of their area with borders to Germany. Where the Maginot Line ends is the Ardennes forest, and then further north where Belgium and Holland are, where these two countries are neutral, the French and the British, they decide they're going to get their best and their most mobile troops, including much of their armour, will drive into this area to defend it should Germany attack that way. And there's a kind of tacit understanding with Belgium that Belgium is desperately trying to stay neutral, but the British and the French work out where they're going to go into something called the Dial Line, which is a river that they're going to defend should the Germans start attacking through Belgium. So this early period, what's known as the phony war over the winter, Hitler was actually quite keen that the attack goes in sooner. It's the German High Command that are holding him off and saying, hang on, we still need more time to try and build up our troops. And they actually hold him off for about 8 months before the attack goes in. 29 different start dates for that invasion, going back into Belgium, France, and the Low Countries. So actually the German High Command are trying to say, hold back a bit, wait. And one of the other problems that Hitler has is the plan that the German High Command come up with, what it actually sort of seems to do is nothing much, in the sense it doesn't seem to lead to a major, or the potential of a major outcome. What they're really doing is a kind of mini Schlieffen plan. They're going to go into Belgium, they're going to perhaps capture bits of the French coast, and if they manage to do that, they can then perhaps try and dominate the Channel, and they'll get some airfields that they can then bomb Britain. So, but it's not a conclusion, it's not an outcome, it's not a dramatic, it's not going to actually give them a victory, it's going to be a start. And again at this time, as part of this is when Hitler in 1939 is taking steel production away from tanks. He's actually putting it into making more shells, because he's really seeing that this forthcoming battle is going to be very much in the line of the First World War. It's going to be a slog, it's going to need artillery, it's going to smash its way through, and we're going to have to attack the Maginot Line. We might capture a bit of coast, but it's going to be artillery, because don't forget it was artillery in World War I that was that dominating factor all the time. It is because a German general, Manstein, has come up with a different plan. It is not accepted by the German High Command, but people get to Hitler. It chimes with Hitler, and Manstein's plan, Manstein's invited to meet Hitler. He explains his arguments there, what he can do. And basically what he's going to suggest is put your armoured formation. And at about this time, the Germans have got together about 10 Panzer division of their overall 150 divisions. So their motorised part of the German military is relatively small. There's 6 other motorised divisions, so 16 out of about 150 are motorised. The vast majority of the rest of the German military are, half of them are still training. They're not particularly good. I think it's about over 45% are over the age of 45 or 40, I think it is. So they are not this supremely dominant, very effective fighting force, but a bit of them has been training hard, has been getting this new equipment. Those are those 10 Panzer divisions. And what Manstein's saying is, if we do a feint into Holland and Belgium, draw the Allies as they were going to do up to the Dial Line, let's draw them that way. And by the way, the Germans have an idea that that's what we're going to do, because in January of 1940, a plane crashes in Belgium in the fog with the German war plans on board. And the Germans try and actually destroy those people who are on the plane, but the Belgians capture it and they leak to the west. So we know that's the way the Germans are going to come, the Western Allies. At the same time, that triggers enough of a reaction in the Western Allies that the Germans also get to see what Britain and France would do in such circumstances. In other words, move into Belgium. So the Germans have given a fair warning of this as well. So what happens with Manstein's idea is do that feint, pretend you're coming through into Holland and Belgium, draw the best of the mobile divisions, the British and the French, into Belgium, up to the Dial line as was expected, but your main force of tanks is actually going to go north of the Maginot Line, through the Ardennes, and go hell for leather for the coast and split that armies of France and Belgium in two. So there'll be a major force of the best of the French and Belgian armies and the British trapped in a pocket. With the Maginot Line, we can deal with that separately. And the point that what Manstein is trying to say is if this works, you get a really important, a significant strategic victory rather than just, here we go, we've started a war going again. Hitler buys into it. He thinks it's a great idea. He's already had some ideas of looking at the Ardennes forest himself. And it is Manstein's plan that then OKW, the German High Command, then puts into operation. There's a number of people that dislike it. They're very nervous about this idea about going hell for leather for the coast. And there's a series of debates go on, some nervousness there, but there's also some senior figures who basically, as soon as Hitler says, I like this plan, they turn completely around and they say, yep, absolutely, Führer, we'll go along with this plan. So that is a plan that is enacted in May of 1940. And in essence, for the Germans, that plan works. What is amazing afterwards is there is a thrust through the Ardennes forest, which is lightly defended by French and Belgian troops. That thrust continues. It crosses the Meuse River at Sedan. This is what Hitler then calls the miracle. He is surprised himself at how well this goes. He just can't quite believe it. After and again, don't forget, Hitler's a First World War soldier. He's got nerves because remembering back to the First World War, that advance all the way down to the Schlieffen plan, right the way down, looks like we're about to capture Paris, and then the Battle of the Marne stops out at the end. So Hitler remembers this, so he is nervous. He is astounded by the victories that the Panzers make. And Guderian, in charge of one of those Panzer groups, he is livid when the nervousness makes its way to the front line in the sense of saying, okay, stop, just let some of the infantry catch up. Let's consolidate a bit before you carry on advancing. Guderian actually resigns, and later in the same day he's actually reinstated in his position. Because as a Panzer commander, this idea that once we've broken through, you don't stop for anything. You go hell for leather. You avoid enemy tanks. At the time, and in this area, in the 1940 campaign area, we've got what many were considered around the world at the time the best tank in the world, the French Char B tank. And this was to meet a French requirement. They liked the idea of the tank in France, but as we've talked earlier, one of the issues about the French army, conscript army, de Gaulle is arguing for a much more professional force. Let's try and upgrade. They are just starting to put armoured divisions, two types of armoured divisions, light ones and heavier ones together. But actually, most of the French soldiers that have been called back up and have entered the front line over that winter of 1940, the phony war, they're reservists. They are the guys that, again, only have a certain amount of training each year. So they want to keep the tactics for that French army simple. We can't get too sophisticated. We can't get too over the top because actually the force we're going to be using, it won't necessarily be up to that. But they do like the idea of the tank. The Char B, when it goes into service, it's got a stunningly effective 37mm. It's an anti-tank gun. It's got a howitzer in the hull that can fire high explosives. It is well armour protected, the thickness of the armour on the front there. It has a problem, like most French tanks. It has this same turret that's on the Samura and other French tanks, where only the commander can be in that top turret, which means he tends to be overworked in what he's doing. In other words, he's trying to command a tank, he's trying to look out for targets, and he could be the one, he'll be firing that anti-tank gun, the high velocity gun that's in the turret as well. But when the Americans were looking at the European tank design just before that May 1940 campaign starts kicking off. They are looking at the Char B, and when you think about it, the Char B is underlying their design for the M3 Grant. In other words, a howitzer in the hull, an anti-tank gun in a turret on the top. So it's the Char B that's really the big beast. And the Germans are well aware of this, so their panzers are told, do not try and engage in fights with French tanks. And when the Germans do, such as a battle at Ston in 1940, the Germans come off very badly. Their advantage is thinking about speed and advancing all the time, keep going to their plan, get to the coast. If you do meet the enemy, charge them quickly, don't hang around at all, get in there quickly, engage and keep moving. And that plan for the Germans, briefly, it works. I mean, it is stunningly effective because not only has that breakthrough at Sedan taken the French by surprise, there's French troops who are retreating before the first German tanks have even crossed the river. There is this enormous shock value that goes through the French High Command, that they become almost paralysed to make sensible decisions about things. Very brave French soldiers are moved from pillar to post, including their armour, gets moved around the place, quite often being surprised sometimes by the Germans and other times being literally losing contact with things like supply bowsers and suddenly finding that actually the Germans are not just 5 miles, they're now 10 miles, 20 miles behind their position. And for a force that thought it was going to be fighting a mainly linear battle, i.e. the Maginot Line and some defensive lines in Belgium, this is just not what they were thinking of. And what comes out so clearly is not just the collapse of the French High Command, but this idea that the whole operation of the Germans is going at a completely different pace and inside the decision-making circle of the French High Command. In other words, you know, they are doing it. The French have turned up for a marathon. They're thinking they're keeping some of their forces back, by the way, thinking this is going to be a long old slog like World War I. We're going to have to gear up industry, etc. The Germans are going hell for leather. They're on a sprint. They are determined to see a quick victory out of this, or that's the design of this campaign. As an example, the French High Commander, he's sacked. The new high person that's put in to replace him ends up going on a fact-finding mission, waste about 3 days when some form of attack against this advancing German and Panzer columns, you know, was absolutely necessary. The British get very frustrated about this. They retreat back from Belgium, a couple of their armoured divisions. They are hoping at Churchill's instigation. He's seeing the French Premier in Paris. He's saying, look, you know, he does the analogy of a tortoise. Its head's come so far out the shell. We should attack. We should bite it off. We should get in there now because of this advance. And that, don't forget, is also what Hitler's nervous about. Britain at the time, after the experimentation with the mechanised force, etc., we've mentioned earlier in the interwar period, they didn't want to invest too much in actually building larger tank fleets. But by the end of the 30s, they've realised they're going to have to start producing things. So we came out with about 3 main types of tanks. The light tank, great for policing empire as well. The light 6B, Vickers came through a series of light tanks. The 6B is one that was mainly in service in 1940. About 1,000 of them were in service. A lot used back in Britain for training, continued on. They see service in the BEF and in North Africa, but phased out very rapidly after that. Relatively thin armour, air-cooled engine, quite speedy, but quite a short vehicle, so it pitches and it rocks, armed with normally a .50, a 50 caliber Vickers machine gun, and next to it in the turret is a .303 Vickers machine gun as well. It also uses a number of its infantry tanks. So what are infantry tanks? Matilda 1 and Matilda 2 tanks. And the idea behind the infantry tank, slow, think ponderous, First World War, heavily armoured, good protection, because it's going to help the infantry advance across the battlefield onto the target. And then if the infantry have done that advance, the idea of the breakthrough, the tank that goes through and does the business, is going to be in Britain the cruiser tank. And in this area we have one of the British cruisers, the A13, the Cruiser Mark I tank. It's a tank there that is built with Christie suspension. The idea of it's a spring inside the side of the vehicle and it has a lot of play and leeway, big wheels, And the whole idea there is it means you can go fast, and because there's a lot of leeway on that spring, you can go over fairly rough ground at speed, so you can be fairly mobile without shaking yourself apart. And they like the look of this, so they actually buy one of Christie's prototype vehicles without a turret on it. It's taken apart, Nuffield organisation takes it all apart, has a good look at it, and we start building tanks with Christie suspension. And RA13 is one of those tanks that was built with the idea that it was going to be fast. It's given a 2-pounder gun, which was a standard anti-tank gun at the time, relatively thin armour protection, but you can see also with the A13 run, they up the armour, and R1 has spaced armour, even extra armour put around the turret. So that's a cruiser tank, and the idea of that type of tank is if you've done a breakthrough, that's the tank that is going to exploit at speed that breakthrough. And it's armed with a 2-pounder gun, an effective anti-tank gun, because if the enemy are using their tanks in a counter-attack, that's what they think they're going to be attacking. It's best that they're defended against, and it will enable it. Again, you're not really supposed to be attacking other tanks, but if you bump into them, you've got the best gun for dealing with enemy tanks if you're going to meet those. So those 3 types of tanks are being used by Britain in 1940. There's not an awful lot of them in France. Over that winter, we've been building up our forces again, shipping out troops to help bolster the French and the Maginot Line. The attack at Arras by 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiment, they have Matilda 1 tanks, they have Matilda 2s, not that many of them. Just about 88 tanks go into that attack, including some light 6Bs as reconnaissance. It is a poorly planned attack. They've had very little time to get themselves ready. Their radios aren't netted. There's no orders groups beforehand. They've got infantry, the Dun light infantry, a battalion each for each of tank regiment that advances. They lose their way as part of the attack, but they go into the side south of Arras of the 7th Panzer Division that's going forward, and this panics the German High Command because reports come back from the rifle regiments. The tanks are at the front of the column, they're further up, Rommel's with them, but this attack from the British going in the side, radio messages go back, help, help, we're being attacked by hundreds of tanks, and that panics the Germans' High Command, because back to that worry of Hitler, is this some sort of trap they're walking into after this miraculous advance, this wonderful way they're going forward? And Rommel has to come back from the head of the column. He helps sort out gun lines. He's literally, his second in command is killed from right next to him. He's right in the front line. He gets everything firing at the British. They continue advances in some areas, but by the end of the afternoon of that attack in May, they end up having to retreat. The French have assisted them, trying to attack as well. Usual problems of blue on blue incidents, all sorts of things. And then from about 6 till 8 in the evening, the Germans pile on with Stuka dive bombers as well and help break up. Only about 22 of the British tanks return. But the key element about the Arras battle, which we'll talk about Arras in another talk because it's such an important battle, what it does, it plays into the German high command sphere, and Hitler yet again says to the panzer divisions, stop. Some of them have already reached the coast, and again they are itching to go back along that northern French coastline into Belgium again, capture the ports, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk. They were all lined up to do that in the 24 hours that Hitler stopped the panzers. And that allowed Gort, the British commander, it allowed the British Army to reinforce those ports overnight from Britain. So we get the guards going into Boulogne, Calais, another tank force goes to Calais. We end up reinforcing those ports overnight, and that stops the Germans when they are getting going again to be able to capture them quickly. So it takes a few days for Calais, Boulogne falls quite quickly, but Dunkirk, of course, holds out. And so that armour that's caught, and the British forces, the French forces, the Belgian forces that are caught in this pocket where the Germans are swept round to the coast, they have an escape route still. And someone's described this 24 hours that saves Europe, because that meant the attack at Arras causes Hitler's panic, stops a delay, and it means yet again that we can save our army and much of the French army that was in that northern pocket off the beaches of Dunkirk, they're taken back to Britain. And that, of course, means we've got something to build on. Now, most of that armour that's there in that 1940 section, of course, for the British, it's left behind. Only a few tanks make it back across the Channel. We reinforce the French army again after Dunkirk. We send another armoured division that's basically sacrificed. Is sent over to France again. The Germans, after they've captured the coast, they have a pause, and then they take on the rest of the French army, which again fights very bravely, but is decimated quite quickly, leading to the surrender in that 1940 campaign. And the amazing thing about it is, of course, then the German propaganda takes hold. Goebbels, his film of the Stuka dive bombers, his film of these advancing tanks, half-tracks, etc. And that gives an impression that is also bought into by many of the Allied countries, because they're looking, what on earth happened? How did we fail so quickly? The supposed best army in Europe, the French, supremely confident, high command. The British army, small but very professional. How on earth did this German force so quickly, 4 years of slog in World War I until an outcome? Here we have a campaign of about 6 weeks, 4 days for a breakthrough. It was just such a revolution in what had happened. People were looking for either excuses or what had been this miracle that had happened. So with Goebbels coming up with his propaganda that here's Hitler saying he's a military genius, when he obviously, as we know, had got doubts about the use of tanks beforehand. He buys in quite late. He hasn't got that bigger tank force. His tanks, when you compare them, look at the stats, Panzer I, Panzer II, Panzer I, in essence, it's a tank that was initially designed for training. Some of them are built to be able to fight. Some were open-topped, earlier ones, just for training. Panzer IIIs, he's only got a certain number coming off the production line with a 37mm gun, their standard anti-tank gun. Panzer IVs, only a certain number, again, small numbers here, with a short-barreled 75mm howitzer. These are not tanks, these superhuman tanks that are going to be able to beat, if you look at them, the numbers, because the Western Allies have more, they've got more tanks, they've got twice as much artillery. These numbers just don't add up, or the quality is not outweighing what they're up against. It is sheer effrontery and the way they are using those tanks in such a small force that's being kept together, punch a hole in that French front line, keep going all the way to the coast. That is their victory. But of course, the propaganda plays and plays and plays on this armoured force and the Stuka dive bombers as if there were thousands and thousands of these things there, when there weren't. And the vast majority of the rest of the German army is coming up behind those 10 Panzer divisions and 6 motorised divisions. They were still marching through the Ardennes forest when the Panzer divisions had reached the coast. That rest of the army that's on foot, that is on horseback, the Germans using more horses in World War II than they do in the First World War. This huge force coming up behind is much more ponderous, much slower, does not necessarily have the influence in the victories as that armoured force had done. But that is the vast majority of the German military in 1940. We, i.e. the public, still buy into that Goebbels propaganda as it is focused on those armoured divisions at the front. And why our Panzer II? Our Panzer II is a later model that was actually captured in North Africa. Why we put it in that area? Because unfortunately, of course, no one had time in Britain in 1940 to be picking up German vehicles and bringing them back for analysis. Only later did that happen. So we've got a later Panzer II there. We put it in this, painted it in that two-tone camouflage scheme that all the Germans were using in 1940 on their armour. That Panzer II is to represent the fact that that was the most numerous German tank that they had available in 1940. And when everyone sees it, you immediately go, my goodness, look at that small 20mm cannon on it. Not this big impressive thing that we somehow get the impression, that the German tank force is always going to have bigger and better tanks than whoever it's fighting against. So that's why those vehicles are put there. We're trying to explain that period in 1940. However much the German official history written back in the 1980s explains all this beautifully, the facts, putting again the evidence together. It's almost like, as I mentioned earlier, the British in the First World War, the vision of the British Army and the generals, etc. It's almost impossible to change that vision. to take that down and actually look at it in a new light. No, the Germans always knew what they were doing. They were much better, with their equipment, etc. It's just not the case then. And yet the remarkable thing is that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be admiring the German military at that time and seeing how clever they were, because their plan works. But it works with so little in the terms of actual resources. It's the imagination, it's the speed, it's the mobility, it's the way they execute that plan, in spite at times of their own high command, in spite of the nervousness of Hitler. They managed to execute Manstein's vision for that quick victory. And that's what we try and sort of illustrate in that 1940 bit with our Light 6B, with that German Panzer II, with our A-13 British cruiser tank, and with that amazing French Char B tank. The Char B that you actually see in that area was captured by the Germans. They put it into their own service, as they did with many captured, what they call Beutepanzers. Captured vehicles are taken into their service. Creates huge problems for the German military in one sense, because, imagine the number of variations of different vehicles, the supply chains, how do you get spare parts? But at the same time, the Germans want to, because their own industry is not producing enough vehicles, it's not producing enough tanks, so they're going to use anything. And what they end up with, those Chars Bs, our particular Char B we have on display, was slight modifications by the Germans when you look at it, and it actually ended up going to the island of Jersey and patrolling Jersey in World War II. At the end of that campaign, most of the German tanks there were then handed back to the French military that was re-establishing itself in 45. This particular Char B was taken back to Britain for analysis, and it went to what they call the School of Tank Technology before, with many other tanks from World War II came to the Tank Museum. So I hope that gives you some idea of that 1940 campaign. I mentioned we'll perhaps later on do a lengthier talk on that build-up period and the actual Battle of Arras, because it's another one of those ones, if you're interested in tanks in particular, is a fascinating period, and of course sets that scene by then the introduction with Goebbels, etc., of the phrase Blitzkrieg, this idea of Hitler doing a complete, one moment he wanted himself to be this diplomatic genius. He even, can you believe, refused the German military at one point to allow them to start their planning for a potential war, because one of his lines was, that would be an insult to my diplomatic skills. When the 1940 campaign is over, he's almost as shocked as anyone, but of course is quite happy to take the plaudits, turns around, thinks he's a military genius with the answer to whatever the problem on the battlefield is going to be. And later, of course, we see how that comes a cropper for him as he thinks he's going to be able to use tanks in a similar manner on the Eastern Front, and that just does not work in the same way. So we hope that's giving you a little bit of the 1940 campaign, a little bit there for you to have a look at and think about. And we're going to carry on after this one by looking at the fighting that went on in North Africa, and that period we know as a desert campaign, and what was going on out there. We are a charity here at the Tank Museum, so if you can support us, please do. Consider joining our Patreon scheme or becoming a member of the Friends. Any donations will go directly towards the Tank Museum and its activities.